Chapter 1. The Return. It always seemed like the rain never stopped in Ireland since I was born. Like the windows were always wet and the sky was grey. I have a first memory of warm hands around me and life beginning. And shining down upon me, the sun with its infinite brightness. My new life in this poetic, graceful island at the edge of the world. A place that still haunts and inspires me with equal force. None of us were asked to be brought so into this world, but I was called from somewhere filled with longing and into the light of a place called Ireland. I would grow and begin and fail and die and burn again and fall into the terror and endless beauty they called life. And the world awaited me. The world, with its beauty and nature, an astounding infinite source. A world that embraced love and violence. And for a newborn, all was open and awaiting those perfect little eyes to absorb. But I somehow remember the rain. Another memory, standing against a wall for a photograph, maybe 3 years old, warm brown legs leaning close to the wall, my hands on my thighs, my eyes looking to the side, the black and white tableau of emotion and presence of the moment frozen in time, ageless and young, excitable and alive, smiling and without regret, as only a child can be. And beneath my skin was my new and unbroken tiny beating heart, the one that pumped the blood of my ancestors around my warm tiny body as I learned to crawl and walk and feed and feel the earth beneath my hands. I was lifted out to the front door after the photo was taken, and I smiled at the world. I found it just right. My child's eyes seeing only perfection. But somewhere in the distance, there remained the unknown in all its majesty. It had been waiting to greet me all my life. I walked beside the one, the shadow, and the depths of my own thoughts and longings. But I started as a boy, and he will remain inside me forever. I was carrying the story of many lives within, my parents and those before, and the ones who were born before them, in a land that always has the remnants of its history written on the faces of the millions here. And maybe it was all mapped out for me somehow. A great, giant destiny unfurling. The experiences and exile from this land yet to come. The suffering of leaving for America and the difficult return. All the encounters in the dark winters in other places. The constant moves abroad and the wound of a culture that followed. My ghostly footprints that left marks like a small transparent shadow all over New York. But back to the beginning. The little Irish boy in a world turning endlessly over. I was now taking my place amongst the humanity that was born anew all over the continents of the planet, and yet would grow and die in waves like a field of roses. All of its thinking, its action, its ideas and dreams and destruction affecting my new and tender soul. I was brought into the world with a push and a scream on the floor of this flat. My mother's bright red face heaving with force and courage, and my soft face open and alive, which made everyone who met me smile, and the hugs of my family. I remember my father opening the door wide, and the sun came through and flooded the room with an unbearable and beautiful light after the rain had gone. We moved into a place near Dublin Bay, a working-class suburb, and even at 3 or 4, I would sit on my front doorstep and look at the world. I would sit in the embrace of velvet night and look at the stars. I would sit and watch the seasons flow. I would sit and let the rain pour itself onto me. We are all born amidst the noise and beauty of the world. My childhood was lived out at the dying end of an old century on its last legs. A century of 100 years filled with sorrow and blood. And my home, Ireland, blighted by a terrible past, but filled in its presence by a poetry and beauty that is a constant revelation. When I reached the point of manhood, I felt the urgency and desire to wander out of the known. The sacred myth of the journey awaited me. Like millions of Irish souls before me, I was cold out of my chair, out of my doorway, out into an existence without a map or compass, to bear witness to the world through my own eyes, to brace myself against endless weight, endless possibilities and encounters, to taste the sweet and the bitter, to make poetry of the ordinary and mundane, to allow the new to change me, to burst the senses wide open, to touch the peaks of mankind and rub my soul like a prism till I could burst with the colours of the world as yet unseen. I left Ireland as a young man, and I arrived back again after 5 wild, long and transformational years as an immigrant in New York City, utterly changed. America, a place of relentless movement and energy, a place of abundance and danger, a place that breaks the heart and invites you to dream, a place that can be soft and lonely, harsh and breathtaking. All of the people of the world dream of America. All of the people of the world long for it. A fever of a place whose long, seductive arms embrace the willing and the foolish. And they come running towards her with willful, innocent eyes, their minds lost with eternal expectation. America, who had gathered the people of the world like a ball of energy and pushed them across the peaks and valleys of the Midwest. She's the tall, inescapable towers of New York and Chicago, the wide open plains of the Dakotas and the bone chill of Alaska. She rips away the old and rebuilds the new. America takes memory and erases it. She rolls over the living and the dead. She bursts with ideas and affirms the impossible. She's a grain of sand on the billion bright windows of Manhattan. She is untouchable and fragmented in poverty and riches that stand side by side in the carnival. She's ugliness and beauty, a concrete tin man nightmare, and also a beautiful woman filled with desire and lust for those that wish it so. I took my suitcase and headed for New York and America, and allowed some kind of fever to carry me away from Ireland, to carry me away from all that I knew, the countless generations of sameness and repression, the stifling landscape of one religion and colour, the broken ideals and the shadows of the Irish I longed to escape. I arrived in New York and would not leave her embrace for 5 years. I was broken and burnt anew. I would savour the avenues and sights. I would cry alone. I would struggle and fight and work and drink and die again and again. I would see myself as never before, the changeling spirit in the mirror in a room in Hell's Kitchen. The distance of the immigrant from home would be equal in measure to my sorrow and understanding of myself. I would be reshaped over and over amongst the 10 million city voices. Their dreams, their sorrows, their anger, their joy and energy would change me. And I would journey and meander in and out of Park Avenue and Brooklyn and Queens and Soho and move many times, sometimes to a bed, sometimes a couch, and sometimes to nowhere at all. The wanderer is reborn in New York streets. The 100 languages, a symphony ringing out across the concrete planet of Manhattan, and I would drown in her, and she would leave scars, and I would call from phones with silver dimes, and I would hear the voices of home. I would leave the receiver down and begin all over again. I would chase dreams in the night as I stacked dishes and lifted furniture in the dense summer heat. I would make friends for life and lose all I knew. I would soar and then fall and then soar again, my fingers almost reaching the stars, only to find they were dirty yellow street lamps that lit the faces of broken hobos along Atlantic Avenue. I would dance under a moon on a rooftop of the world and climb higher again to the tip of a tower to look down on clouds and catch the magnificence of broken teeth landscape of New York. New York. All that was man's possibilities and eccentricities. All the street style and eloquence and fashion and architecture and humanity without limit. A billion ideas quickly rising and 1,000 heartbreaks behind the windows of grime and smoke. Falling towers and wicked darkness, and spirit and hope in faces that remained nameless to me. Too many together and somehow functioning in a beautiful dance. I was all of these worlds, and yet I was an Irish spirit, a Celtic soul, all merged and doused in the flames of constant experience. The years came and went, and my immigrant life grew into a wild ocean of experience. But on one ordinary day, when I crossed the Brooklyn Bridge with the wind cutting across my face, a revelation came upon me. It was like all my life came rushing into my lungs as the traffic vibrated beneath my legs, as the cyclists moved like bolts of lightning across the bridge, and the momentum of place gave my senses extraordinary flight. I realized that I had surrendered myself, my soul consumed by America and New York. I was this city. I was the dream and nightmare of city living. I was the depth and the power and steel cables. I was the billion words that floated on my tongue, and the savage, wondrous voices I heard through apartment walls. Some of my dreams had realized themselves without my push, and some would die here alone. Yet as I sat on a bench along the bridge and watched this decadent metropolis, I knew that I was ending our affair. In this moment of great knowing, within me was a sad and profound shift in my soul. I stubbed out my cigarette, extinguishing the fire of youthful fever, and decided to return to Ireland, to brave the mirror of all I feared, and continue a new kind of odyssey. 1 week later, I left New York on a bright December day, my bones shaking in the cold. I looked out upon a city that had taken and given to me in equal measure, and bid it a painful farewell. I loved the winter sun, sitting in the airport waiting on my flight back to Ireland. I watched as it created intense red waves that swept across the faces in the lobby. Children on the floor laughing and playing. Men and women stretched across the seats, dreaming and resting. And my own tired eyes filled with vast and inexpressible experiences of America. I gripped my suitcase. I took a last look at the skyline. I took a last look at a city that both bewitched and tore my heart. A city that had festered in the dark when buildings fell. A city that I cursed and embraced. A city whose shape and depth I knew like my own skin. I might return again one day, but my innocence was gone forever. And in the distance, through the thick glass of the airport, I could see all my ghosts on every avenue and diner. I felt a swell of emotion, neither tears nor happiness, just some odd grief and exultation. My way of seeing life itself had been destroyed, shattered like glass, lost on the streets, and I had to begin anew, a rebirth in my old home. As I left the city and took the short flight over the dark Atlantic towards my old home, Ireland, I could feel a multitude of emotions stirring again. My Irish blood and the veins it courses through invite within me that old painful calling of home. My body was filled with deep, conflicting emotions, suspended here so far up in the heavens as clouds like tiny puffs of smoke ascended like ghosts near my window. The silence of the sky and the turmoil of feelings within. I stood and walked the length of the plain. I took in all of the people and could see many faces looking out of the window of their own lives. I had walked, literally, thousands of miles in New York. I had let my feet warm on beaches or in city parks, with my blistered heels softened by the grass. The heat and stench of that city were ingrained in my senses. As I moved softly through the center of the plain, so high up it was as if my thoughts were moving around me, drifting through my hands, as I touched each seat, wandering down the aisle. They passed outwards onto the tips of my fingers. My body was alive with them, my experiences, reverberating with all I had seen and felt. Voices filled my mind and wanted to rush out onto my lips. The voices of all I had encountered, the mad, the furious, the kind, and even the dead. I got back to my seat and rested my eyes. I could feel the hum of the engine and hydraulics being released. The plane veered steeply towards Ireland. I put a cushion between my head and the window and thought of all the people below, living and dying and sleeping. Ireland, at the edge of the world and in my thoughts for so long now, was bringing itself closer to me, drawing me into its grasp and embrace. The bridge between what was and what was to be narrowed as I saw the vast green of my homeland come into view through the window of the plane. Its brown and green hills, and ancient walls and hedgerows marking man's own sweat and hand, laying claim to an eternal landscape that he could never possess. The plane dropped onto the wet tarmac, eventually shuddering to a stop. The passengers rushed off in a flurry of activity, yet I remained seated. I knew that something immense was now within, and I was alone with it inside me. Maybe it was written in my eyes. I could not tell. Eyes that had seen enough to change my very essence and my hope into something strange and unknowable within. I instinctively touched the scar which I had earned from being hit by a truck in New York. There was an overgrowth of bone where my collarbone had been separated. It was never the same after the accident. Something of me was erased, an innocence burnt, shaken out of me and left dying in the gutters and avenues of Manhattan. Ireland to me, in the moments when I loved her, was the very centre of myth and a sadness in the eyes of the world. She was a joyous, wild flower singing in the wind. She was the depth of my heart and the poet within. She was a small and ancient place. She was a place filled with light and the dreams of those who were awake. She was the land of sorrow and beauty. She was a mirage and a place of poets and smiles. She was to me the burst of sunlight on the world. She was the breaking waves of the Atlantic. She was the magnificence of green and yellow and blue and red flowers in all seasons undying. She was the orange sunsets and the breaking dawn filled with the symphony of nature and life. She was the pulsing heart by the ocean of tears. She was my grief and my salvation. She was my loss and my beginning. She was a well that had fed the millions who have come from afar to drink from her. She was my family and friends. She was my shame and my agony from near and afar. She was the 5 million, the soft race of Irish dreamers and talkers and lovers. She was the hunger of the past and the scar that runs under the soft earth. She was the farmer's hands and the thunderous hooves of horses over the broken soil of the West by the ocean at the end of the world. It was where I was born, and where I had left and returned to again. And I am filled with her, this sensual and sad place. All my memories are bound within the roads and windows and fog and rain of this land. And Ireland, for better or for worse, had remained a flame that was a constant which I kept burning inside me as I had walked my road in New York City. I carried a silent and invisible bag of sorrows and experiences off the plane as I finally moved my tired body out of my seat on a typical grey Dublin day. Others took their shopping bags, chattering and noisy in contrast to my deep silence and reticence. I followed the lines of people through the checkout alone. The man behind the counter checked my passport. He looked at me, and I looked right through him. My mind was lost to my return. He closed my passport and said in a low, monotone voice, "Welcome home." This was home by birth and nationality and by blood. But in my heart and soul, I was not so sure. It felt like a river I was afraid to dip my hands into. It felt somber and dead at this moment. I put the passport in my pocket and walked on. And whatever voice drew me to home was the one I had to trust and follow. The arrivals door opened, and I could see the masses of Irish awaiting their loved ones' return. I walked past them and into the open air. My feet finally touched this green and grey earth. I tasted something that was achingly familiar and yet somehow dark. Dark from growing up. A child tasting sun and the voices of her memory now faded. a mirror of what had passed and long departed, yet lingered somewhere in the rich river of my soul, and the noise and traffic that awoke me from jet lag, and I could hear the familiar strains of the Dublin brogue, and the faces seemed white and winter pale. The greyness seemed to touch their very hearts. Was this my tribe? I looked for the epic Celtic energy I had dreamt and romanticised of when I was away. I looked for it in the bag handlers, and the mothers and fathers, and in the eyes of their children. I looked for it amongst the lines of waiting faces, but what was reflected back to me was a kind of deadness and silence. Something seemed lost. Or maybe I was just tired. And maybe it was just my own wounded heart. I had heard my own people were changed. The culture had become filled but also hungry, filled with possessions but emptied of soul and life. And this wall of sadness was palpable. I struggled through the crowds. I looked behind me, and New York was gone. No more magnificent buildings or wild nights. No more sorrow in the rain or burning in the midday sun. No more crowded streets or the dark graveyard world of the subways, or the paper sellers with their soft voices. Gone were the fruit sellers, and the kind Mexicans who cut and plucked the roses late at night to the sounds of music. No more smells of fresh bread from Italian immigrant streets. No more the sins that washed away along the dirty shores, or Times Square boiling and wild and filled with every race on earth. No more the hustlers or the pimps and losers, and midnight walks loosening the soul of all of its weight. No more the wild thunderstorms that cool the summer streets and wash the memories clean. No more is the longing for distant places when it all became too much, or the shared joy of friends on the floor of my Brooklyn apartment as we shared our warrior stories and exposed their scars in the deep, silent night as New York rolled by us. I looked out the window of the taxi as it took me to my parents' home. Ireland was to me still a place of deep contrasts. 10 minutes into my journey past the vast stone and brick of the airport, we were already passing by fields and plains of gold and green grass. The sky was opening up. It was an odd feeling not to be in a land dominated by man-made creations like New York. A man walked his dog along the pathways as we sped by, and I could see tall oak trees alone in the centre of a field. And then I could begin to see all of the familiar landmarks of my home. This land suddenly seemed vivid and shaped by God's own rough fingers that were ploughed into the earth. A God, wild and pagan, who brings ravens over the land as black wild shapes. And in storms his breath blows the white foamy waves onto the sea-green cliffs that hug the edges of this island. You could hear his voice in the winds of winter that break the boughs of weakened trees. His presence is in the small houses that dot the west of Ireland like tiny white boxes, dwarfed by the epic mountains and valleys. And he is in the vast skies above, watching and listening in moments of darkness and profound light. And he is in the eyes and spirit of this haunted nation. As my car was resting in a long line of traffic, I suddenly understood how small and alone Ireland was. We had that in common. It stood battered against the wild Atlantic Ocean, lonely and beautiful and astonishing. This tiny green island, whose shoots had wound their way around the hearts of so many from so far away, yet whose dark history would penetrate the most joy-filled soul and open the door of despair. The beauty and the sorrow in Ireland were enmeshed like two lovers that wept in raptures of absence and closeness forever to be as one. The car moved closer to Gilbarrack, my old home, along the coast of Dublin. I asked the taximan to drive me close to the ocean. As it came into view, the sea was all grey and disturbed, its peaks and furrowed soft swells like a mirror to my heart. I handed the taximan his money and walked to the door to greet my parents. The same front door and faces, same smiles. We all stood frozen, my suitcase on the ground, my entire life in bags. I could hear my heartbeat. I could see my mother's worn hands clenched and a bright look in her eyes at the return of her youngest. I went inside and I drank tea. It tasted sweet, an ancient tradition simplified in an ordinary suburban home. I lifted the cup to my lips again and got hit with a dozen sensations from New York, like the shadow of it was still within my soul. It was hard to shake off. I put my stuff upstairs. I was only going to be here for a while until I could figure out where I was going next. The room was the same, the walls with pale blue wallpaper, and the sounds of seagulls on the roofs of houses all around. The passing hum of cars, and children playing in the football pitch across the road. All changing, but still somehow the same. I took out my clothes. They were impressed and wrinkled, like folded bodies of experience. Memories of the streets of New York, crushed up in a hurry and packed tight as I had fled the metropolis. I unfurled them for a while, but I was weary. I felt worn down and anxious. I looked across the street that I grew up on, and it had shrunk in contrast to the vastness of my experience. It had shriveled and withered with age. Where once it was quiet and unassuming, it had now exploded with pointless traffic and anger. The world had come to Ireland, the ugly, grasping hands of progress. I'd walked back into my old world and felt homeless, like a spirit unmoored and restless. And I looked at the faces of my blood and kin, and I felt I was the mirror to their anguish and worry and quiet desperation. And so I was home. The idea of home, a complex and simple word that gathers within me some sense of undefined longing. The beauty and heartache of their longing struck me deeply many times. I dreamed for them the dreams and expectations that they had never lived out themselves. I had gone to a place they had never been, but only seen on television and in the stories of others. But now their son was home, and I was the only one who had ever left. I filled the room with my odyssey in New York. I ate and drank and stumbled over stories from America. I could hear my voice anew. It had a New York tint to it. It was all straight angles and harsh vowels. It was fast-tongued steel slang and the brutal directness of a tough city. I'd lost the softness and the quiet song of my own Irish accent. My parents seemed tiny, and the house was immaculate. And we had all grown older, and we had all grown apart and distant. Later that evening, we all sat in silence and watched the television, and I gripped the arm of the sofa in my fingers, and I wanted to run and take a plane back to America. I rushed to the toilet, and I could hear my heart thumping. It was like my very essence was trying to overcome me. The untold stories, the misery, the wounds, and the tears from my time away was threatening to break me apart. I had no idea that all of your experiences could be an actual physical weight on your soul. I went outside and I stood at the door. I breathed in the air and sighed. I looked at my mother's garden. A single rose was planted in the middle of the soft grass nearby. It was a beautiful blood-red rose, strong thorns running along its stem, its root firmly in the earth, unmoved by the soft wind I was inhaling into my lungs while I watched the world from my parents' door. It had been there for many years, weathering the rain and the traffic, unchanged as I wandered the New York streets for 5 years, as the pain and discord of my own spirit was continually changed and renewing. The lone figure washed away from familiarity amid the dense millions. A city blowing away youth and giving way to the shadows and pursuits of the adult world. A playground of all that is full of foreboding and intoxication. How easily the temptations of a new, godless world grip the tender young heart of a young immigrant and dreamer. Took him away from his family, took him away from the sweet and the light of youth. The spirit within me was no longer that of a boy. Washed away was the gentleness of Ireland, now replaced with a harshness and strength. The electric energy of America now burned along the seam of my spirit, giving me something new and frightening to carry. My journey was measured by the stumbles and failures. It was measured by all I had absorbed in America. By the tears shed alone in a room as insane New York traffic spread its vile tension of modernity into my weary veins. The radiance of an empire and the wisdom from another world which I had in my possession stayed with me from moment to moment. It was the accumulated experiences of language, people, and places, memories that renewed themselves, stirring me awake, making me present and alive. But the scars of self-pity cover the constant truth of reality. And each city breath I took meant I thought I could never go home again. What was home? This thing or place which painfully remained outside of my grasp now more than ever before. But I was back. And as I looked in the mirror of my old bedroom, in my old childhood home, I thought to myself that maybe I was not such a pitiable creature. Maybe it was heroic in a way, that I had allowed myself to risk all and leave when others had no courage but to dream from their chairs and wither and fade. In contrast to many whose banal, habitual life sickens their heart, I had thrust myself into the very center of life, existing in the depths of unknown rivers. I had brought back all of this to Ireland, a place of struggle and a history at times of hunger and despair. Back to the swollen ocean of people, of mirth, depth, and misery and awe. This nation of fools and magicians and warriors. And Ireland is your twin. No matter where you look within, you will see a mirror of your shadow looking back into your terror-filled eyes. Its bleak and powerful history shapes that which is essential in you. The house in which I lived, the block, the street, the red bricks and small windows I looked out upon season after season, I was now able to touch them with my very hands. But the familiar street was now an alien presence. Memories of a boyhood spent cycling alone on empty streets. Yet underneath the tarmac and concrete lay something so profound and mysterious and quiet. A Celtic burning river of history and myth, of tears and shame and poetry and wildness. The blood of my tribe was scattered throughout all corners of the world, yet still connected through their birthplace no matter where they roamed. Deeply and fully merged with the muck and earth of Ireland, like brown and blood flowing in the veins. This resonated loudly within me, no matter how much I chose to ignore it. It had haunted me countless times when I had emigrated. There's a certain inevitability of a psychic shock that hits the soft soul of the Irishman when he leaves and breaks free. His road broken apart at times by something familiar and daunting. And as I had wandered the avenues of New York in all the winters and empty summers, in all its shaded concrete glory, I carried the rhythms of the world in my heart. Yet, delicate thoughts of Ireland, of home and family, and those that make you whole, were at times as a weight between the ribs. And this odd heaviness was like sinking into an abyss. I'd seen it along Irish bars in Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn. New and old immigrants frozen in their hearts, poisoning the great river of their souls with booze and drugs, nailed to their bar seats between two worlds. The world they left and the one they were currently in. In New York, he just wanted to be new, to be reborn, dipped into the waters of the millions, to shine and bleach your past away, to be part of it all but utterly adrift in a beautiful river of thoughts and a billion ideas reaching deep onto the tips of ruse of maddening city dreamers. But the strain of something dark, staining your thoughts, was always close to the centre of your Irish spirit. The weakness within was the sound of a powerful Irish root snapping and breaking as you finally managed to escape her grasp. When I fled to New York and came back to Ireland, I began a steep descent, having climbed so high. It was a dive into an old, familiar ocean, into my past. There was much of Ireland I did not know. There was much of the secret poetry of the now, like a bird landing on the tip of a branch, its hammering heart and dark eyes singing of a revelation to come. I slept that night, deep, for the first time in 5 years on Irish soil. I had opened the window and let the cool air in. The streets were like a graveyard, all the souls sleeping. My own mind for a time was like a symphony again of shapes and memories all recent and unnerving, of towers disintegrating, and of a city deluge that cried out, of car accidents and evictions and hunger and madness and the New York nights. It caused me to shake and turn in my bed, but eventually it quietened. The sleeping monster within fled back into the shadows. I drifted off into the darkness of sleep, exhausted, and somehow afraid of the morning to come.